Hello, everyone. Welcome to Baltimore Racial Justice Action's 13th of the month. My name is Julia Scott, and I am with BRJA as one of the co-planners of the 13th of the month. And so we welcome you to our October 2023 event. Next slide. So, during our time together, we want to make sure we go over some virtual housekeeping. So we encourage folks to keep their videos on. If you cannot, it is totally okay. We're asking people to mute themselves when they're not speaking so everyone can hear what's going on. And of course, when there's time to speak, which we will have audience opportunities to speak, we of course encourage you to do just that. So we do want to hear what you have to say in order for you to actually engage with the content and learn and unpack and grow. Engagement is certainly something that we encourage. So please make sure during a question and answer portion or a discussion or using the actual chat on Zoom, you can do that. Next slide. All right, so we, of course, do these events every 13th of every month. And so we have coming up next month the impossibility of justice system in a two-party system. So that's going to be our November 13th event. You can register here by using the QR code. You can also use our Eventbrite, where you can, of course, see all of our past events as well as what we have coming up for other like trainings or events. So please follow that link. And before we really get into the nitty-gritty of everything today, we just want to make sure we have a content and recording advisory. We are recording this. This goes on the BRJA YouTube. So if you want to see this event or past events, you can certainly go there. But given the historic and violent nature of racism in this country and how it's been perpetuated on Black and non-Black folks of color, people of color, an examination of history will be challenging, right? So because of this, we want to provide a content warning at the beginning of our public offerings like this one. And because of the U.S. history of violence against Black and non-Black people of color, these conversations might surface for you moments of discomfort, pain, struggle with the contents. And so you're encouraged during our time together for this one, any other event, to take care of yourself during that time. So we're going to provide that, and then we're going to start getting into our actual topic for today. So this is, I think, like, I'm not sure if Michelle wants to put in the chat or not, like the third or fourth time we've done this topic, but underreported current events is something we are doing this month. We will be discussing different events that are going on, or topics rather, that are happening in our country, in the world, and looking at it through an anti-racist and anti-oppressive lens. So before we get started, I do have a couple of audience questions. So I'm going to ask folks to share for the next slide. So how do you consume your news? Do you watch the TV? Are you reading the newspaper? Are you getting it from social media, which of course usually has links from various newspapers or magazines? And what papers and news stations do you normally engage with, or do you normally watch? I know for myself, I usually consume news like on the TV. I do read the newspaper once in a while. My dad is actually a bigger newspaper reader than I am. But because of my relationship with social media, I'm usually like getting different links and reading to engage that way. And I'm usually watching pretty like liberal or left-leaning news. I try to actually get all sorts of views and to kind of understand exactly what's going on. But that's, MSNBC is very big in our house. Shout out for my dad for them. And a lot of like Democracy Now, a lot of Baltimore Beat is a huge thing that I read when they put out their papers. So that's who I read. Does anybody else want to share what they read or who they're actually reading?
I can share. I I do read things locally. I think the Baltimore Banner is one of the new ones. So I follow them. So I can, follow things that are happening locally. I also I watch all the mainstream news, including Fox, just because I like to know what they're talking about. It's also interesting because I feel like they tend to cover a lot more of the Black Lives Matter protests, or at least at one point they were, when MSNBC and I forget the other mainstream one that I watch. Yeah, CNN. When they had kind of stopped doing it, they were still following a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, not for the right reasons, but I still found it interesting and informative. And I think for me, it's all about like understanding the lens and the framing that the person is giving me the information, and then I can take what things that I decide are important, or just still put a story together. Even though obviously I feel like all media is propaganda. And then social media. I do use TikTok and Facebook to follow certain people and their takes on things. YouTube is another source that I use. And then I also get like news articles that pop up on my phone. I think I have a couple apps for that. So like I can't even think of I can't think of the some of the news journals that pop up on my phone right now, but that's
yeah. Yeah, I think that's the cool thing is that we live in a world now where obviously, technology, wherever we fall on our thoughts on it, has connected us more broadly to a range of thought in media. And so you're not just limited to what you see locally or nationally, but now you have access to journalists and news organizations and videos from America, from Europe, from Africa, and you're able to kind of really begin to understand and piece issues together as you get information, as you read. So that's a really cool thing. Of course, there can be downsides to that depending on your thought process, but the information is available currently. So I think that's really cool. Anybody else want to share what type of news they engage with?
I'll share if this is convenient.
Yes.
And I also put in the chat that my news media sources are international, because I like to see how other countries are viewing US policy. And Black owned media that is owned or curated by other people of color, because I think that those media sources give a more nuanced take than white owned media. And they also oftentimes include a historical context that white owned media does not. White owned media starts from the event as if there was nothing before. And it just seems as if it's not necessarily reporting, but it is more clickbait, which means that the more emotion that someone is showing, that the better, as opposed to trying to place it within a context for the audience. And in terms of Twitter sources, I listen and look at both conservative and progressive, because I do want to see the different perspectives that those groups are holding about particular events.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's really important that as we get information, being able to see it from various sides, even if you disagree with the other side, allows you to, I think, to see what exactly is being said on the other side, what are people's points of view, and especially I think if you're into doing like either training or mobilizing type of work, that's going to be important to understand how do you get people to understand what's happening. How do you make sure if you're you got to educate folks in a certain area, like that's really important to know. So that's essentially really, really important when it comes to the news. And so I'm going to actually go to the next slide. I think, when we talk about why this topic is important, the news shapes a lot of what we understand about where we live, about the world, what is happening in our communities, what is happening in our schools, what's happening in our jobs. And so the news shapes a lot of what we see. It informs how we vote. It informs, if we vote. it informs everything about our daily lives. And if we don't know what's going on, that's usually the first place that people look. And so it's really important for us to examine how the media usually sidesteps or sometimes sugarcoats, violent racist actions, while, kind of just acting as if it's a regular day, right? We have to understand that the media that we receive itself is even usually seen through the lens of white supremacy and oppression. So a lot of the time, the news that we get, even our progressive or left-leaning, can be seen or, told to us and supporting the very thing that we are fighting against, that we are trying to unlearn. So white supremacy, capitalism, all of those things are included in our news. And so it's important to recognize that as we're receiving information. And so as all of us are trying to sharpen our anti-racist or an anti-oppressive lens, it is important for us to really dig deep into the information that we receive and where we receive it from and why we receive the information the way that we do. Why is the journalist or the newscaster taking this position when we're receiving information? So that is important. And so we have a couple of topics today that we are going to go over. I'm really excited to talk about one of the biggest things that we've seen in the news as of late, especially since 2020, is about policing. And so our topics today are actually going to be around that subject. And so our first topic is about the Stop Cop City movement. So Stop Cop City is something that has been going on for a few years now. It is happening in Atlanta. And so we are going to show a quick video in case folks are not, up to speed on what Cop City actually is and why it is being protested. So the city of Atlanta plans to build a $90 million police training facility, which citizens and protesters have started calling Cop City. If constructed, it would be, of course, one of the largest militarized police training centers in the country. And it will also be built by cutting down Atlanta's largest green space. Which is another issue. So those that oppose the project state that continued militarization and expansion of a policing strategy is now going to only harm communities, but it is going to continue to destruct the forest and the protected forest. When you get into this discussion about, police, taking into consideration, I think, as Adar was saying about understanding what was going on before, or what has been happening, it is important to understand when this stuff really started coming out. This was off the heels of the 2020 protest of George Floyd. We've been having a conversation for years in Black and I think of marginalized spaces, people of color, other identities, about the use of police and how policing operates for particular folks versus what is being said about the police, on a grander scale. And so it's important to understand that during 2020, when everyone was on like this kind of quote unquote same page about policing and what they are and are not allowed to do, and when people were putting up Black squares on Instagram, that, folks behind the scenes were like, well, we're going to build this training center for the police. And that is a problem, considering that this is a complete opposition to what a lot of the citizens of Atlanta are saying they actually want their tax dollars to be used for, their money to be used for. So let's go to the next slide. So let's go into actually what protesters are actually saying about Cop City and why it is a problem. So the first is that it will expand the criminalization of marginalized people, as well as the carceral state, prisons, jails. And so that system is something that a lot of people are not interested in expanding in their communities. So as I mentioned, The proposal came in the wake of the nationwide anti-police protests in 2020. And so Cop City will actually allow police, not just from Atlanta, but globally, to learn various tactics, using whether it be shooting folks or how to repress folks who are protesting. So this can actually impact free speech in the future. It can impact people's ability to protest, which is their right, especially in this country. So that's one of the major things that a lot of the protesters are saying. According to the original proposal, 43% of the training at Cop City will be officers outside of Atlanta. So not just the Atlanta Police Department, but police departments from around the country can go to Cop City and get training, and then go back to their communities and use what they've learned to do that. Now, obviously, we've had a lot of conversation over the last 2 years about the tactics that the police are receiving, the training that police are receiving already before there is a big training center. And so that's been up for debate if what they're doing is actually correct or should be happening. So when we think about this on a larger scale, what are they going to be teaching if Cop City does come to fruition? What are they going to be teaching police officers? How will that intensify some of the issues that we've been seeing in the pockets, across the country? So that's one of the biggest points of the protest, that they do not want to have this continue. Policing is already an issue. We want to start to look at what we can do. We want to give them more money and more space to do what they're already doing. The second thing is that this is an environmental issue as much as it's about a policing issue. The fact that the training center will be built on the largest green space in Atlanta is something that is, very important to think about. Maybe a year or so ago, BRJA did a 13th on environmental racism. And so this actually connects to one of those, what we were talking about in that 13th of the month. So I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly. The Weelaunee Forest in Atlanta, like I said, is the largest green space, and to Atlanteans, it's considered one of the 4 lungs of Atlanta. So environmentalists have been saying that by destroying this area, they are actually accelerating some of the urban heat island effect, so it can get hotter. And it's extremely concerning, considering that the neighborhoods that surround this forest are mostly filled with Black residents. And so those folks who live in that area are either at the poverty line or below the poverty line. So what we're seeing, as we discussed in that environmental training, that environmental 13th, is that usually when you're seeing a lot of the environmental impacts of environmental racism, they are near Black neighborhoods. So air quality, where people are putting their trash, lack of green space, a lot of pavement and concrete, which intensifies heat. These are things, especially as we're in a conversation about our climate, that folks who are from an environmentalist perspective are saying that creating this is going to harm everyone in that area. It's going to impact the amount of air that is good in the area already. So the forest is usually maintained to help with air quality. So I believe that the forest already about like 19 million pounds of air pollutants a year are like filtered through the forest. So if that is taken away, where do those pollutants go? They actually impact the citizens that live near it. The sewage pollution of the river in the area has already had major issues. It was already named one of the most endangered rivers in America in 2021. And so something of this scale, like Cop City, will only continue to ruin the river, and so the water and the folks who use that. So this is not just about the cops, but it's also about the environment and those who are impacted by the environment. I'm in school for social work, And one of the things that we talked about recently is the need for green space as a way of improving mental health. And if we're thinking about this, who has access to green space, who's allowed to have access to green space, is something that should be food for thought as we're talking about environmental racism, as we're talking about building training centers for police. And so, especially considering that Cop City will include a mock kind of city for practice urban warfare. So that includes like burn towers, bomb simulations, multiple firing ranges. So folks would rather, of course, have a forest versus that. The next point is that it has faced intense backlash from the public. So, as the video had stated, in 2021, almost like 2 years ago, September of 2021, the city council had 17 hours of public comments. You could actually go on YouTube. You can watch it. They were there for hours, where over 1,000 Atlanta residents went and shared why they are against this being done in their city, in their area. 70% of which they were against building the facility, and they are feeling like they are being ignored. They feel like the people they have voted for or put in office are not listening to them. They have been organizing, doing door knocking. They have had peaceful protests. There have been people who have been protesting in the actual forest. And they have been saying that they would rather the money go to their education system, their healthcare system, their roads. But it seems that more money is being allocated for policing versus the things that would actually make it a lot easier and more helpful for them to have like fruitful, enjoyable lives. And so one of the things to think about, at least that sticks out to me, is that if we are asking people to vote every 2 or 4 years, and the idea is that as a citizen, I'm putting my trust in you, that you are going to go and represent me and protect me. And if a group of us are saying, this is not what we want for our city, and you say, well, that's just kind of what it is, we can't change it, that I think calls into question the entire, system that we have all been kind of engaging with. So a lot of residents are very, very passionate about this subject, and they have said very clearly in those at that city council meeting that Cop City will not be built. And that is a thing that we should be continuing to pay attention to. Unfortunately, police have already killed a Cop City protester. So in January of 2023, so this year, 26-year-old forest defender Manuel Terren, they were shot over 50 times by an Atlanta police officer, by a task force of Atlanta police, Georgia State Police, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, who they were attempting to clear the area for construction. And so the initial report was that Terren had shot an officer and that they were killed in self-defense. However, the autopsy report showed that that was not true, that they were sitting cross-legged position with their hands up when they were killed. And they were shot over 50 times. I believe maybe a couple weeks ago that police officer was cleared on those charges, which is just going to show already this is the type of stuff that Atlanteans are already upset about, and they're saying they don't want more of. And if these are the tactics that police are using already, then what is to say when they actually get a training center that is doing all the things that I listed earlier, how that is going to impact the citizens. So this is also the first and only instance in the history of the U.S. environmental protesting that an activist has been killed by police. Terren's thoughts were, before he was killed, we're not going to beat them at violence. They're very, very good at violence. We're not. We win through nonviolence. That's really the only way we can win. We don't want more people to die. We don't want Atlanta to turn into a war zone. So those were the words of someone who was killed, and a protester who was killed. And it is, like I said, questioning what exactly are the tactics that the police are going to be learning? Are they going to be any different than what is happening now? So incidents like these only show that it's probably going to be more of the usual, and that is a problem, particularly for those who are protesting or who are going against what is happening in their state. And lastly, we have law enforcement has also already started to take legal action against protesters. So police have targeted peaceful protests over, for a while on trumped up charges of domestic terrorism under a 2017 state legislation meant to criminalize protesters. So that is something that is already on the books that people have also had an issue with, but the police are using to silence people who are protesting or who are opposed to Cop City. They also raided a music festival, the police did, where hundreds of people were just enjoying live music. It was an event to support a week of action around Cop City. And so police grabbed random attendees, and they targeted those who came from outside of Georgia. And so a number of protesters are still being charged with domestic terrorism as a tactic to scare others from continuing to protest, continuing to fight back, and continuing to push their government to stop this building of Cop City. And so I think one of the things that's really just important, like this story has so many lanes and viewpoints, and when I look at it through an AR/AO lens, I mentioned the environmental aspect. I mentioned the fact that policing itself has a history of, of course, being cruel to Black people and folks of color, and other folks who are maybe living below the poverty line. It has an issue with our ability to protest, our free speech, and to assemble. It is getting into how the state is being used and the laws are being used to protect police, and that you can be named a domestic terrorist if you are using your right to protest. So building Cop City is a concentrated global effort to really stop the change that is happening across the country and the world, or in the communities that are saying, we don't want cops here. We don't want more policing here. We want change policing. We don't want any policing. And it's also, I think, when we think about, and we're seeing even recently, how people are protesting. People are protesting in the streets for various things daily. If police are told that they can do what they want, they will stop that. They will use what they have learned at Cop City or places like it to stop those protests, to stop folks from fighting back. And that is an issue that we all should be concerned about in a country where, we're allowed to protest. So that is that. I do want to go to the next slide. So why is all of this important? I mentioned this is coming off the heels of the 2020 protests, and this project only, shows the issues that were lifted up in those protests are something that they're not going to leave us. Like, it's only going to continue. Those conversations are only going to get deeper, and hopefully people will begin to understand why topics like defunding the police, or abolition, or doing more around policing, it's something that has to be discussed and changed. Organizers were a part of a referendum campaign to let voters decide the fate of Cop City, and so the coalition followed those rules. They got a bunch of signatures, nearly the double that was actually required, and the city is refusing to count those signatures. I really want people to sit with that and to understand how wild that actually is. it's unfortunately not new, but it's something I think in 2023, especially, we should be paying close attention to. Next year is a voting year. And it's a lot of things that people are very, very much against. When we think about this in the, the kind of like subject of voting, and if you're not counting people's signatures who are against something that's happening in their backyard, how much is that actually safe for the system that we're supposed to trust? So that's one of the biggest things that's playing in my brain right now. And also, lastly, this kind of model is actually expanding, particularly in Baltimore. So the Baltimore Banner, speaking of one of our local papers, and on August 25th, they shared that there has been a proposal for a new joint training facility for Baltimore's police and fire departments. And even wilder, that this what is being called Cop City Baltimore would be on the campus of Coppin State University. Now, if you were not familiar, Coppin State is a historically Black college or university, or an HBCU. And so right now, the plan is a current price tag of $330 million. I cannot stress enough, my flags are kind of going up. I have a lot of questions about, for one, why at Coppin? Why in that area in West Baltimore, when I know that folks around that area have been asking for a lot of things, and nothing on that list included, I think, a training facility. And why can't this money or our tax money be used for other things that we know could improve our living in Baltimore, in the city? So when we think about this, I want us to really kind of like not just think about our relationship with police, but what does it mean to have training centers that can stop you from protesting, when you have city council members, also that happened in Atlanta, but you could say you refuse this, you don't want it in your neighborhood, you don't want it in your city, you don't want it in your state, and that your voice is not being heard. And all of the other issues, what needs to be knocked down to build something like that? Could there be something in its place that could actually benefit more people? Those are the questions that I'm kind of grappling with as I'm learning more and reading more about Cop City, and how people's relationship with policing has been changing, and what is actually being done on the ground. And I think for my kind of last point, before we go to our next topic, we have got to really also think about, why is this not being discussed as much as it needs to in our local or national news? To me, this is a very big story. Right now, it's happening, I think, in small pockets. It's happening, obviously, I think, on more progressive news. I've seen it even on MSNBC a few times. But for everything that has been happening around this project, there should be more discussion around the political parts of this, the environmental parts of this, and how this is impacting those in Atlanta, and how this can spread, because the idea is already spreading. I think on the next slide is actually a picture from what is being proposed. One of the plans. This is from the Baltimore Banner. And so if you read that article, make sure I put it in the chat so folks can read it. But this is what they are proposing for a Cop City Baltimore, as folks have been calling it. So I would love to hear people's thoughts about this. I also see that the chat has a lot of information, and I have not been able to look at that. So did anyone have any thoughts or questions or comments?
Something I was thinking about as you were talking, Julia, thank you for covering that in such depth. Some thoughts that I was having is around, some people don't like it when we say we live in a police state, right? But I personally feel like that's exactly what we're living in. You can't go to the grocery store without seeing police.
Mm-hmm.
place where people are buying food. Why do we have police there, right? We have police in our schools. We have police in almost every space, public space in this country. And also the other thing I was thinking about is the fact that how much our police force has been militarized, right? So we have a situation where soldiers are going overseas, trying out different tactics in war settings, and literally bringing those same tactics to our citizens in the streets. It's not okay either way, right?
Right.
But to use tactics that you're using against people when you're in a state of, literally in a state of war, and then bringing them to residential streets against unarmed civilians, protesters, citizens who are protesting peacefully is a problem. When you're bringing tanks from overseas and other militarized gear from overseas that you've used in war to our streets, that's a problem. And that's going to increase with things like cop cities. So that's just something that I was thinking about.
Yes, absolutely. That is a whole topic on the militarization of the police and how we've seen an uptick in that in this country, and we've already seen the impacts of it. We've already seen what happens to communities where policing is increased and militarized policing is increased, as well as surveillance is increased. And that is something, you know, a few years ago, I listened to what was it? It was probably WEAA, which is the radio station on Morgan State University's campus, and they were interviewing like an indigenous person. This is when I think like the water situation was happening. This was during Obama, and you know, he said, he was like, they practice here, like they practice with us first, and then they move and they kind of replicate. And so I think that people have got to understand the history of this country is just that. They start with one group or one space and they replicate that. And so, you know, when you're starting to see now Cop City is not just in Atlanta, but now we want to spend $330 million for one in Baltimore. Like, and it's not just, I think there's some other places too that are kind of like having this kind of conversation. I think that we have to start thinking about why Atlanta is a big deal, why we should be thinking more deeply and learning more about what's happening in Atlanta, so we know when it comes to our cities and towns and places that we know what to do, how to fight, and how to protect ourselves, as well as, you know, how to get folks involved, because it is certainly something to see it just kind of happening increasingly. Did anybody else want to share? I'm also, yes, absolutely. Adar was saying in the chat, this has been going on for so long. It is just that now white America is being impacted by it. Absolutely. Yeah, historically, this is something I think has obviously been happening for a very long time. And I think that, as we kind of mentioned earlier about the technology being able to be connected in a lot more ways, we're seeing now how this you know, who's being impacted and why they're upset about it. So absolutely. Did anyone else want to share our thoughts? Okay. All right, so I'm going to give the floor to, I think, Michelle.
Yes. Thank you, Julia. That was great. So to piggyback on what Julia laid out about these cop cities that are popping up, unfortunately, and the militarization of our police systems, unfortunately, there's also another trend that's happening where police forces are now using robots to help police citizens. And so there's a, excuse me, a pilot program right now in New York using robots, and then robot dogs. And then I believe San Francisco has a program where they are actually, they've recently voted to make it legal for police robots to kill citizens, to use lethal force on citizens. And I believe LA also has a program. There's probably other cities as well, but that's what I found in my research. That this is a growing trend of robots being used to assist police forces. And the reasons why it's troubling is because these robots are using facial recognition technology. That's an, we're talking about invasions of privacy. We already know that facial recognition technology is biased towards Black people and people of color, that they have a harder time recognizing our features because the people who are programming these things are typically white men. And so there's much more chance of Black people being, what's the word I'm looking for? Mistaken identity is much likely to happen for Black people and people of color. AI technology is just racist because we live in a racist society, right? So if we live in a racist society and every level and everything within our society is drenched in racism, it's no surprise that our AI also is racist. But we have not changed any of this technology before we are now using it to have robots assist our police force. And that is definitely a scary problem. So I do have a short clip that I want us to watch about what's happening in San Francisco, and then we can discuss. So that's just a small clip about what's happening in San Francisco. But like I said, there's also a program in New York City and LA and probably other cities that are underway right now. I see a comment in the chat about, I guess cops think that the robots kill Black people, they can't be sued. I'm not sure how any of that works, but yeah, there's this argument that is that robots and AI is supposed to be impartial, and that's just not the case at all. Studies and research has already shown that AI technology is extremely racist. So it's just a very troubling trend that is happening along with these formation of these cop cities. Anyone else have thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, first, it's very wild. But yeah, when I think about this in conjunction with the cop city stuff, it's very, very scary to think that a city would just say, well, we don't even have any protocols right now as to like when we even use it. And it's like you don't. And I think it goes to show, this can be used at any time. And I think, as someone had put in the chat, like, what happens when someone is killed, especially if someone is innocent?
Right.
Like, who does that fall on? Like, police are already protected. What are they gonna do with the technology? Like, are they gonna like take the robot out back? Like, I'm trying to understand exactly what happens when it makes a mistake, or when it makes a mistake. And so those are the kind of questions that, I think technology is something that we're quote unquote supposed to depend on, and that we're supposed to control it. But if we're getting to a situation where it ends up controlling us and making decisions for us, as opposed to the very real, person to person, what, police need to actually to talk to people, that's something that's very, it's fascinating and very scary.
It is very scary. Very scary. And the other thought that, in this whole conversation that I keep, and maybe this was already said, but it's just like all this money is being spent at the root of most the root of most crime is poverty. And it's like we as a country refuse to deal with poverty. We refuse to, because God forbid if a Black person gets something for free.
Yeah.
And so poverty is just being ignored as it increases. And child poverty in this country has increased. People's basic necessities like clean water. In Baltimore City, how many schools in Baltimore City don't have air conditioning? As we continue to have hotter and hotter summers in this, hotter springs, hotter summers, Baltimore City students are missing days of school. But we're going to spend all this money on a cop city. Like, it's just, it's ridiculous.
Cop city and robots. It's like, I mean, I don't know.
Any other comments, thoughts about Cop City or about robots or policing in general?
I think,
You know, I really liked what you were saying about God forbid that Black people get any free thing, right? And the lack of acknowledgement of how the system is set up to advantage white people. And then with that, you know, 100-yard free start, call it merit. And so there's so many ways in which the country gaslights people as to what is truly happening.
Yeah.
We know that AI, I really see AI and the whole Cop City thing, as well as other military policing, as the same thing. Both of those things are going to be used as tools of repression. Both of those things, and especially AI, will be used to continue the work of framing people, you know, especially Black people, of creating false narratives and putting people in it.
Yeah.
And so we see all of this coming, and the country is not yet willing to face it or call it what it is. And to me, that's the scariest thing of all, because it's not just the politicians that are pushing this. It is the people in this country who so refuse to see what is happening that they continue to vote for and to move along in life, knowing that this thing is happening and not moving against it because they know that it will not yet impact their loved ones.
Mhm.
And to me, that's the greater tragedy around all of this,
Right.
as well as ways in which people will go into racial innocence and apathy and I didn't know when the chickens come home to roost.
Mhm. Thank you, Adar. I just want to read comments in the chat that Merrick made. The level of poverty in Baltimore is profound, but they want to basically build a quasi-military complex in the middle of some of the poorest parts of town. It's an affront to our safety and dignity. Thank you.
yeah, I mean, considering everything that, you know, I'm seeing in the chat, that Adar said, that, you know, even like, you know, what you and I have spoken about, I'm very much concerned in a city where there's so much that is needed in order to improve it. Like literally like Baltimore is losing citizens every single year. And I'm sure that the argument will be like, oh, because it's unsafe. And so therefore the policing center will make people feel safe. And I understand that kind of knee-jerk, you know, kind of reaction or thought or argument. But police have not necessarily made people feel safe who already live here, who've been living here for generations. And so what's very scary is that for all of its innovation, America refuses to think differently about how to deal with the issues that we're being impacted by. And so definitely thinking about, like, as you mentioned, like poverty is a huge part of crime, and you know that's one thing. Health, mental health, huge impacts on what we see with crime. Education, like all of the things that actually shape our lives, the food that we eat, where we live, like all of those things are indicators of crime and violence. And yet we continue to give a lot more money to policing, to militarize policing, to weapons, as opposed to, well, hey, why are people actually poor? Like, and what do we need to do to actually solve that?
Right.
Like, you know, why are kids not eating? Why are you know, people sleeping on the street? Like, those are issues. Like if it's awful if someone is robbed, right? Like I've been robbed. I'm sure a lot of us have dealt with, someone stealing from us, and it's awful, it's traumatic. And at the same time, when I get some distance from the trauma, I'm like, well, why was that person even made to steal
Right.
from me? And I don't even have anything.
Right.
Like, and here's the thing, I might have more than them. And that, of course, like is like the blatant kind of reaction of why people do it. But at the same time, it's like, but I don't have that much. So like, what exactly are they taking, and why are they taking it? Why do they like to be pushed to do that? There's something else happening. And the fact that we don't, focus on that solution is very troubling.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's really a lot of my thoughts around that.
Any other thoughts or comments? That's all I had, Julia.
Okay, so we wanted to have this discussion because this is happening in the news. For some people, this is very, real because it's happening in their backyard. It's happening right in front of them. And for some of us, it has not happened just yet. And so, as you are reading the paper and as you are, having discussions with friends and families, making sure that you are having these conversations, like what exactly is happening in Atlanta, what is happening in New York, what is happening in Baltimore, and why it's important to really kind of think about why our news isn't talking about it more. And if they are talking about it, what lens they are working from, what stories they're sharing, who is being interviewed, and what can you do on the ground possibly to challenge. I think that, it's very easy to just be upset. I've certainly done it. You can't fight every single battle, but I do think that information is power. Being informed and being in spaces with people to discuss topics such as these allow us to grow and to unpack and to, I think, sharpen our analysis of what is happening to, our communities and, to the systems that we depend on to live. So making sure that you are being included into all sorts of news that is happening around the world and around the nation and how it impacts you. If it doesn't impact you now, it more than likely will impact you later. And so it's better to get the information now and to see what's going on versus, when RoboCop comes to you, you are not caught unawares. So I want to thank you all for your time. Where's the slideshow? I am not sure. Can we put the slideshow up? There we go. So once again, before we wrap up for the evening, our November event is going to be the impossibility of justice in a two-party system. I'm very, very excited for this one. Love this art on this, on this here. If you would like to register for that event, you can put your phone up here to the QR code. Technology. It's wild. To register for these events are free. And I think we'll probably also put one in the chat. And we hope to see you at the November events. You can also follow BRJA on social media. So we are on YouTube. Type in Baltimore Racial Justice Action. Click subscribe so you can see events like these and more. We're also on Facebook, so you can find us there. And we are also on Instagram. So we're at Be More Anti-Racist on Instagram. In the past, we share our events, as well as we might have like what are those things called that we've done in the past, Michelle? I forgot. Like the discussions.
Was it the hot takes? Is that what we call
Yes,
them?
we've done hot takes, so
Okay.
discussions like, with kind of like pop culture with an anti-racist and anti-oppressive lens and edge to it. Also, we're on LinkedIn. It's Baltimore Racial Justice Action. And this work, of course, is done to, of course, improve our understanding of racism and oppression. And so we know that you are here because you are interested in that work. So if you would like to support our mutual work by becoming a monthly sustainer or a one-time donor for events like these and other trainings that we offer, please also use the QR code to donate and support our work financially. Oh, that's a slide we don't need to see. So I think we are wrapped up for today. I want to thank you all once again for coming and joining us on a Friday. I know that it is lovely outside, so I understand. But thank you for coming to talk about underreported events. And if there's any kind of story that you're interested in or you see, take the time to sit, read it, do some research, and talk to people about it. So a lot of the time, I've learned from listening to others, and it really does expand your worldview and getting as much news as possible so we know what's happening in our world.